Please welcome David Rubenstein, President of the Economic Club of Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone, to our 13th virtual signature event since we began doing these signature events a few months ago. Now, I'd like to have Wes Moore for our first guest. Wes, thank you very much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, David. Great seeing you.
Now, Wes Moore is somebody that has an unusual life story, and I would like to go through that a bit because it's so extraordinary. I think all of you will be quite impressed with what you hear, and then we'll go into what he's doing at Robinhood, and then also his new book that's coming out next week. So first, Wes, you were born in Baltimore, is that right?
Yeah, I'm a Maryland guy, and where most of my family still is.
Okay, so you're born in Baltimore, but at the age of 4, your mother took you to New York because she thought that was a better place to raise you. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I only have 2 memories of my father. One time was when he saved me from a beating that I was going to get from my mom for hitting my sister, because my mother always only had a couple rules in her house, was that men do not put their hands on women. And when she saw me hit my sister, she went after me, and my father saved me, explained to me what I'd done so wrong. And the only other memory I have of him was 6 months later when I was about 4 years old, when I watched him die in front of me. And
He
my
died
mother,
from what?
he died from something called acute epiglottitis, which is a virus where essentially all of us have an epiglottis in our throat. Every time we breathe or chew, the epiglottis goes up. It allows air into your windpipe. Acute epiglottitis is essentially where the epiglottis becomes so swollen that it is so heavy that it just sits on top of your windpipe. So essentially, his body suffocated itself, and
Your voice is broken up. It's silent.
Sorry,
Okay.
is that better now?
Now it's okay. All right.
Yeah,
So your mother moved you to New York,
yeah. So
and
my
you were
mother moved
raised
to New York.
there,
Yeah.
and then
So
you were a superstar student in school.
yeah, I wish that was the case, David. No, when I went to New York, that was probably some of the most trying moments of my life, because I found myself, consistently hurting people that love me so I could impress people that could care less about me. And the truth is that, the first time that I felt handcuffs on my wrist was when I was 11 years old. I think I was just filled with a lot of confusion and hurt and pain that I was still very much trying to process about what happened to my dad and why my neighborhood felt so chronically neglected. And I think that it eventually turned around that when I was 13 years old, after years of threatening me, my mother eventually sent me to military school.
Okay, so you were not bar mitzvahed, right? At 13.
I was not bar mitzvahed. No, I was not. I had a manhood ceremony of a different type.
Okay,
A different type.
so you
And that's
did
complete system.
okay. You did okay in the military academy, well enough to get into Johns Hopkins, right?
Yeah, well, so I finished when I finished at the military academy. I found that I enjoyed it, and there was this graduated sense of responsibility and leadership that I relished. And when I finished high school, I actually joined the Army, and I enlisted in the Army. I went through ROTC. By the time I went to a junior college first. I went to a community college, got a 2-year degree. And then when it was time to transfer, I was already a second lieutenant in the Army. And I went to say, I want to go back home. So I applied to go to Johns Hopkins University.
All right, you got into Johns Hopkins, and then you became a Rhodes Scholar. So what did you do to become a Rhodes Scholar? Not only 32 were picked every year out of the United States. So what did you do to deserve to be a Rhodes Scholar?
Well, I mean, I remember actually going back to a conversation I had with another former Rhodes Scholar who was the former mayor of Baltimore, a gentleman named Kurt Schmoke. And I was doing an internship with Mayor Schmoke. And on the last day of my internship, he called me into his office, and he knew about my grades. He knew about my extracurriculars. And he asked me, he said, have you ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship? And he brought me over to a picture that sat right next to his desk, and he pointed to it. That was a picture of him and his Rhodes class. And he said, I want you to consider applying for this. And that story is really important to me, because had he not done that, had not had that conversation, nothing would have changed about my grades or my criteria or my qualifications. I just wouldn't have even known that the door was there. And they never would have known about me. And it was the importance of the fact that in that moment, he shed a light that now has helped to light a path for the remainder of my career. But it was that moment that helped to do it.
So you got a Rhodes Scholarship, you went to Oxford, And after that, did you go to law school or business school or something? Or what did you do right afterwards?
Right after that, I actually went into the investment world because I'm really more of I have more of a quantitative mind than a qualitative mind. But I remember actually I was in London and I was working in finance, and I got a phone call from a buddy of mine, a guy who's now General Mike Fenzel. At that time, he was Major Mike Fenzel in the Army. And I enlisted in the service. I was a paratrooper. I'd done all my training, but now this was 2002 and 2003 actually. And many of the soldiers I trained with were now on their second and third deployments, and I'd never deployed. And he called me up one day and he said something to me where he said, "When are you going to join the fight?" And it was indicting to hear that from my dear friend, because I knew exactly what he meant. And I remember thinking about it and praying on it. And I literally went back 2 days later, and I went back to my job in finance, and I told them that I was called up. I wasn't called up. I did a by name request, and I joined back with the 82nd Airborne Division, and went over to deploy with them.
So you joined the 82nd Airborne, and then you went to Afghanistan?
We did, yes.
Now, did your mother, weren't you worried that?
Yeah. I think there was definitely the worry. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I told my family that it was a call up, because had they known I actually volunteered to do it, it probably would have been a very different conversation. But the thing that I went over there was that level of fear that they all had. But I also knew that for me it was the right decision. And I think about my time over there, where I saw some of the greatest acts of heroism that I've ever witnessed in my life. I mean, I'm still in awe of the men and women that I served with. And when I thought about the conflict that was going on over there, I remember at that time in 2005, it was all Iraq. All the news was Iraq. And so in some ways, when I told people that I was going to Afghanistan, they're like, well, at least it's not Iraq. Without realizing that the first time that we got into, had shots on, was my second day there. So you realize very quickly that Afghanistan was a much hotter spot than people understood at that time.
So you survived Afghanistan, and you came back to the United States, and you were selected as a White House Fellow. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you worked for Condoleezza Rice?
I did, which was a remarkable experience. And specifically coming back after deployment to do that, where you spend a year seeing how policies are implemented, and then you come back the next year to see how policies are made. And you realize not just the power of the folks who are making the policy, but also, frankly, in many ways, the disconnect between policies that are made and policies that are implemented. And I think the ability to be there and, frankly, to work for a person in Secretary Rice, and also people like Dina Powell, who didn't just involve me, but who really were genuinely curious about my experiences deployed overseas and wanted to incorporate that into how we thought about policy. That was really meaningful to me.
Okay, so eventually you went into the finance world, but then about 4 years ago, somebody said to you, why don't you become the president of Robin Hood Foundation?
Yeah.
So didn't you tell people that you were already going to do things in the finance world? You'd already served your country and you'd done enough, or you didn't say that?
No, I didn't say that. But what's interesting is that my first reaction when Robin Hood approached me, my first reaction actually was no. And I gave them 3 reasons. I said, one is I live in Baltimore. So I don't know how you're going to lead an organization that's based in New York. The second piece was I told them that I'm enjoying the work that I'm doing now, and the third piece was I said I've been critical of philanthropy in the past, and the person who was leading the chairing the search committee at that time, he said no, he said we've done our diligence, we've seen it, and it's pretty public because it's all over YouTube that I'm pretty critical of philanthropy. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said, but what if I told you that we actually think many of the things that you said are right? And that's actually why we wanted to talk to you. Okay. And that became a really interesting opportunity for me that I don't believe in charity. I believe in change. And I believe that the role of organizations like Robin Hood is to really be change agents and use all muscles and tools at our disposal to be able to drive that in our society.
Now, Robin Hood is focused on New York City. It's about 30 years old now. But what does it mainly do in New York City?
Yeah, so Robin Hood is now 32 years old and really had a core focus of saying how do we end poverty as we know it. And so we focus on everything funding from education to housing to transportation to mental physical health to criminal justice reform, understanding the interconnectedness of poverty. That you're never going to say, okay, how do you fix poverty? Well, do one thing, because poverty is completely intertwined into every aspect of our society. It's how we're asking people to live, what we're asking them to drink, the air we're asking them to breathe, the schools we're asking them to attend. And so how do we attack it from every single facet is really how Robinhood has approached it. And one of the things that we've been able to do in our time in Robinhood is know that, while Robinhood is New York born and New York bred and New York focused, poverty is not a New York issue. And so we've been able to really expand and think about how do we work in partnerships with other groups around the country to be able to think about our work on a holistic basis.
Now, in your spare time, you've written 3 books.
Yeah.
The
Yes.
first one is called The Other Wes Moore. Who is the other Wes Moore?
So the other Wes Moore is actually a gentleman I learned about right when I received the Rhodes Scholarship, because right after I received the Rhodes Scholarship, the Baltimore Sun, which is my hometown paper, wrote an article about how this local kid, despite a pretty uneven childhood, now was just announced as a Rhodes Scholar. And at the same time, they were writing a whole series of articles about 4 guys who robbed a jewelry store and in a botched jewelry store robbery ended up murdering an off-duty police officer. And there was a 12-day national manhunt for these 4 guys. And finally, after 12 days, all 4 guys were caught. And I found out through these articles that one of the people that the police were looking for was a guy whose name was also Wes Moore. And I one day decided to write him a note. And a month later, I got a letter back from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore, which is a maximum security facility. And I learned how much more we had in common than just our names. We were from the same area, around the same age, both grew up in single parent households, both had academic and disciplinary troubles. And so that one letter turned into dozens of letters, those dozens of letters turned into dozens of visits. And after knowing Wes for a few years, someone approached me and said, would you consider writing about these parallel lives and the things that our society should learn about how we're far too quick to either congratulate or castigate without understanding pathways.
And what happened to him now?
He is currently in year 19 of his life sentence in prison. Him, his older brother, and 2 other guys who were there, where one was found guilty for the murder. The other 3 were found guilty of felony murder. And the way felony murder works is the main question that the judge will ask is, were you there? Because the person who gets the highest sentence, everyone else will receive that same sentence. So he's now in year 19 of a life without parole sentence.
Next week, you'll have a new book coming out. It deals with Freddie Gray, 5 days. Talk about Freddie Gray, who he was and what happened to him.
Yeah, so Freddie Gray was a 25-year-old young man, an African-American young man in Baltimore, who one day made eye contact with police and ran. And the police chased him. And back then, that was actually a law that you could not make eye contact and flee from police if you were in certain neighborhoods. And he did. His neighborhood happened to be one of those neighborhoods. Eventually, he was arrested. And an hour after he was arrested, he was in a coma. And a week after he was placed in a coma, he died. And there was weeks of protests that took place in Baltimore demanding accountability and transparency. And those protests were all peaceful until one night, actually was the night of Freddie's funeral when he was laid to rest, that they were no longer peaceful. And eventually Maryland went into a state of emergency and the National Guard was called in. And the thing that I really wanted to explore with this story was, I look at the 5 days surrounding his funeral and this uprising, and I look at it through the eyes of 8 different people, from a basketball star turned protester to a police major who actually grew up in West Baltimore, to the son of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, who's the head of baseball operations, that when the Orioles played a game with no fans, he was one of the people that helped make the final decision. So a collection of people who are helping to tell a story of what was going on at that time and helping to highlight the fact that this was not just about policing, and the thing that should garner rage within us is not just Freddie's death. It was his life. It was the fact that his life from birth was surrounded by poverty and inequity. And if we're not willing to understand the trauma and damage of his life, then we have no right to stand there and just mourn his death. We have to do both.
So tell us why you're living in Baltimore. It's my hometown. It's a nice place. Has some challenges for sure. Your job is in New York. Why don't you just pick up and move to New York?
Because I'm a Baltimorean. I love my city, flaws and all. You can't understand who I am without understanding Baltimore. And the truth is that when we're talking about understanding the challenge of cities, Baltimore is actually a pretty important example because we understand that the level of divide didn't happen accidentally. There's history to it. There's laws. There is the history of redlining and the history of discriminatory housing policy, the discriminatory lending policies that really do define everyday modern day life within the city of Baltimore now. And I feel like Baltimore in many ways is one of these places where our story is still very much being written every single day. And I'm just very proud to be one of the 600,000 authors of a pretty powerful, what I think is going to be a pretty powerful story.
So your mentor and friend, Kurt Schmoke, ran for mayor and served 3 terms as mayor of Baltimore. Has anybody ever suggested to you you might run for office in Baltimore or Maryland? You've never heard that before?
I've never heard that before, David. No, I mean, I'm a person who really does firmly believe, and I spend no time thinking about the next job. I spend thinking about doing the best job possible in what you're doing right now, and we've got a big fight ahead of us. You know, this issue of poverty is terrible and traumatic, and frankly, getting worse. I mean, we've seen we've watched 11 years of job growth go away in 11 weeks. You know, we've watched how, if you look at 23% of people who have lost their jobs due to COVID-19 alone, the reality is 23% of people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were living in poverty before COVID-19. So, i.e., this was the working poor, people who were working jobs, in some cases multiple jobs, and still living in poverty. And so I know that my life's work is going to be trying to create spaces where opportunity and ambition can actually meet each other, where we can actually create pathways for growth and opportunity for people in a very real and in a very consistent way. And so I've never been focused on a title. I'm focused on impact, and I think we're making a real impact right now.
So the protests that have arisen recently because of the killings of certain people that are well known, and George Floyd, among others, what is your reaction to what the United States should do about this, or what people can do about it to make a difference and improve that?
Well, I think the thing that people have to remember in all of this is that what people are protesting right now is not just inequitable policing, and frankly, it's not even just the levels of economic disparity. We have to understand that what's being protested right now also is the history of race and racism in this country, and I think we carry around this myth that racism is an individual act. So, you know, unless you are saying the N-word or, you know, wearing a hood, that that you're not racist. And we have to dispel with that, because racism is a system. It's a system that allows for right now for a black person with a college degree to have less earning power than a white person who's a high school dropout. That's a fact. That's a system. And I think what we're talking about right now is it's a system that has to be confronted in a very real way. It's a system that's been built and reinforced for the past 400 years. And the reason that I think we have to be, and when we say what do we need to do about it, I think we have to be deliberate about understanding how it is interlaced and interplayed in so many of these systems. I think we have to be honest about the fact that it does exist, and it's not to play a gotcha. It's to say that it's the only way we're going to move forward. And frankly, I think the reality is we have to deal with this process with a real truth and a trauma and a reconciliation process within our society. You know, we've watched other countries that have been able to look at some of their greatest pains and to be able to be honest about them. And whether it's South Africa or Chile, whether it's Northern Ireland or what Canada just pulled off with their reconciliation commission, The history of race goes back as far as the history of this country. And I think there needs to be a way that our country can wrestle with that, to sit with that, and also to know that the only way we're going to get better from it is not to ignore it, but actually is to make sure that our individual actions are then, and our individual goodness is something that can be proactively go after a system that is really embedded in so much of how we exist.
So I assume your 6- and 9-year-old don't tell you every day they're proud of what you're doing because they're probably focused on other things. But what about
Yeah, I'm sorry. You said, and you said, what about
your mother and your grandmother? They tell you how proud they are of what you've achieved?
I'm proud of them. I mean, my grandfather was the first one in my family born in this country. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and when he was 4 years old, his father, my great-grandfather, who's a minister, was run out of the country by the Ku Klux Klan because he was too vocal. And the majority of my family vowed to never come back to this country. And the majority of my family have not. They went back to Jamaica and they stayed there. My grandfather did. My grandfather came back to this country in his 20s because he said this was his birth home and this is the place where he wanted to raise his family. And that's when they moved to the Bronx, where he became a minister in the South Bronx. My grandmother became a school teacher in the South Bronx for 29 years. They believed in this country. They believe in the promise of this country. And it's their DNA that runs through me that makes me have that same exact belief. And so there is nothing that I will ever do that can make them more proud of me than I am proud and thankful of them and for what they gave to me.
Wes, it's an incredible story. I want to thank you for coming. Now, your book coming out next week is called 5 Days, The Reckoning of an American City.
Yes.
All right. And I don't want to sound like your book agent, but I hope people buy it because it's no doubt going to be a great book as your previous two were. Thank you very much for coming, Wes.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Bye. Now we are privileged to have the mayor of the Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, the Honorable Muriel Bowser. Thank you very much, Mayor, for coming today and coming back so shortly after you were here just a few weeks ago.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure.
So anything new in the District of Columbia these days?
Well, there's a lot new all over our country and certainly right here in Washington, D.C. But I couldn't be more proud of our team and residents who are helping to confront this pandemic and the many days of demonstrations we've had in D.C.
So let's talk about something that everybody in the world has seen, the protest that occurred in Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square a few weeks ago. So who was supposed to police that? Was that the District of Columbia Police, the National Guard? Who was really in charge of policing it, in your view?
Well, I think there's been a lot of finger pointing going on, and you've probably watched the federal forces point fingers at each other, which is the problem that we have called out, David. These in Washington, D.C., we police demonstrations all the time. We're the seat of the federal government. People come here to address their grievances with the government. We do parades. We do the 4th of July. We do inaugurations. And all of those are done in partnership with the Metropolitan Police Department, or the DC Police, which was our local police, and with federal police as well that have responsibilities in the district, the United States Park Police, the Capitol Police, and sometimes we use the DC Guard on those large scale events. So we approach all of those events in that way. The federal government, however, is responsible for federal facilities like the White House and Lafayette Park in front of the White House. And all of the people that you saw, and I assume you're referring to the very unfortunate event where peaceful protesters were cleared from in front of the park. And they were all federal police, we believe, under the command of the Attorney General.
Okay, so in the future, have you and the federal government coordinated such that if something like that happened again, it would be clear who's in charge of policing things, or is that not worked out yet?
Well, it is clear who's in charge of policing things. I think from the federal point of view, which I can't tell them how to do their business, that you're right to question if there was a legitimate chain of command. Who were the park police listening to? Who were the National Guardsmen assigned to listen to? Because then nobody can really think of a situation where the attorney general should be directing those officials. So those are some things that certainly have to be worked out on the federal end, and it may come down to the Congress getting the right answers.
Well, there's a bill in Congress now that would prevent the president from federalizing the DC police force, I believe. I believe the president must have the authority somehow to federalize the DC police force. Is that a realistic possibility that he would do that, or that bill will pass?
Well, I think no one ever thought of a scenario where that threat would be made, or certainly that it would ever happen. But there is a provision in our home rule charter. It has some hurdles, but they're not very high hurdles that would enable the president to require the mayor of the district to release the Metropolitan Police Department, which we would regard as a very not just a significant affront to our autonomy that's granted to us, but we think it would make the district less safe. Because the federal government, with whatever chain of command they have determined, would not be in the best position to provide local policing.
Okay, so speaking of Congress, there's a number of other bills that Congress is taking up recently, or going to be taking up, relating to the district. One of them deals with making the district the 51st state. I believe that's going to be taken up by the House shortly. What is your prognosis of where that stands in terms of getting passed?
Well, I would say that we are very excited about it. We expect that the House of Representatives is going to vote in the affirmative for DC statehood, which has never happened in the history of the statehood struggle. This bill has more co-sponsors in the House. In fact, it has enough to pass just with the number of people who have co-sponsored it. And it has a record number of senators who are also on the bill. We were with the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader Hoyer the other day with our Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, and they announced the vote date, which is going to be next Friday. And this is amid the Congress trying to work on a myriad of pieces of legislation during the pandemic, and they haven't been able to schedule everything. But they made the point to schedule this before they go out and recess, and I think that is a huge development in the move towards statehood.
Does it require a majority vote or a 2/3 vote?
It requires a simple majority in both houses. Okay. So where we are is you've heard the president and the Senate Majority Leader call out the issue in the starkest partisan terms. And our argument is that this is not about partisanship, it's about democracy, and that people who pay every bit of the federal taxes as any other American, in fact, more per capita than any jurisdiction, has to be represented by a voting member of the House and 2 voting senators.
And some of people who oppose it basically saying that it's basically racial, that you're essentially going to give a city that is to some extent half black, 3 additional voting members in the House and the Senate. Is that basically it? That
is, that argument has been made for decades, that we were too Democratic and too black in Washington, D.C. to be considered a state. And we know that is, those are not the principles of equal representation.
The Congress is also supposed to be dealing with providing you another $700 million that you got shortchanged in the first CARES Act. Is there any chance of you're getting that money at this point, you think?
Well, we're continuing to work it. Speaker Pelosi has very much lived up to her word to us to make sure that it was dealt with in the next piece of legislation, which is the HEROES Act. And we continue to work it from all sides.
So let's go back to the protest. Not too long after the protest, during the middle of the night, Black Lives Matter became the name of the plaza in front of or behind, I guess, Lafayette Park. Did you make that decision yourself? Do you need the city council to approve it? How does that get done?
I made that decision, and I made it the moment I was walking through the streets of Washington and saw federal troops that had advanced from Lafayette Square onto DC streets. And I was with a group of our interfaith leaders who were actually wanting to go to St. John's Church and couldn't because there were a line of federal officers there. I knew then that we had to reclaim those streets and send a powerful message that not only are these DC streets, but we have a moment in history right now to stand up for our Constitution, stand up for fairness and justice in policing, and to hold officials accountable. And I knew that Black Lives Matter Plaza could be that place.
Okay. Now, you've been sued to stop that designation. I assume you're confident you'll win the lawsuit?
Well, I'm very happy to defend my decision in the district, in court, in any court.
So this has been a challenging time for other reasons as well. You have to deal with the COVID-19. So let's talk about that easy decision you have to make there.
Yeah.
So on COVID-19, we're now in phase 1.
Yes.
And tomorrow you're making an announcement on whether phase 2 will occur or not. What are the decisions and criteria you're going to use about whether to go into phase 2?
Well, David, we have been very methodical, and I think so far our experience with the spread of the virus is suggesting that we're doing it the right way. Today, for example, we reported 56 new cases. That's among the lowest number that we've had since since mid-March. So that's a very good thing. We've identified our metrics. We have been communicating on almost a daily basis how we're responding to COVID-19. And our residents and businesses have told me in no uncertain terms that they really appreciate how we are approaching this. So we look at several metrics, including a 14-day decline in transmission, which we achieved today, how we are contact tracing and how quickly we can be in touch with a person with a positive case and their contacts. We're also looking at test positivity. So how many people are testing positive over the number of total tests, and we're way below 10%, which is a good thing. And so I think that we're going to approach entering phase 2 in very good shape.
Okay, now 4th of July is coming up, and sometimes people gather on the 4th of July in large groups. What are you going to do to prevent that, or how are you going to deal with that?
Well, that's a big question. And certainly we've been talking about mass gatherings, especially since we've seen these First Amendment demonstrations, which is what they would be called in the public safety world. In the public health world, they're called mass gatherings. And so it is a big concern when we see people, especially people who are traveling here from other places, where they might have hot spots. We continue to be very concerned. So we've told people to get tested if they think they need a test. We've opened up our testing all around the city. Now our fire department is participating in free testing in evenings throughout the city, which is very helpful. I'm actually going to be talking to the Interior Secretary today. I'm not exactly sure what the plans for the National Park Service are, and so we're going to be getting to the bottom of what their plans are.
Okay, so let's talk about the DC police force. We saw in Atlanta and Minneapolis some signs of police conduct that obviously was inappropriate and deadly. So are the DC police trained differently than the Minneapolis or Atlanta police? And are you fairly confident that something like we saw in those instances couldn't happen in DC?
Well, I'm not an expert on Minneapolis or Atlanta, but I can tell you about our experience in Washington, D.C. And I think that any mayor will tell you that police and community relations that's a relationship we work on each and every day. But a bad incident can happen anytime or any place. And so we recognize that. And so what we have done over the last 18 years is reform the Metropolitan Police Department. Many people will remember when our police department didn't enjoy a great reputation. In fact, we entered into a consent decree back in 2002 with the Department of Justice addressing use of force. And since then, we have consistently implemented reforms to the point that when the DC auditor asked the independent monitor to come in recently within the last several years and review DC police, that independent monitor found that DC police were acting in an unbiased constitutional way. And so we thought that that was a very good mark on how, not only how our reforms have been implemented, but how they have taken root in the culture. Let me give you a couple of examples. We've professionalized our police force over the years. We require our officers to have some higher education credits to come into the department. That means they've been more exposed and they're actually older than in some other departments. We've implemented de-escalation training. We've outfitted all of our officers with body-worn camera, which we think adds a layer of accountability that's very important. We've been very intentional about ensuring that we have a diverse police department as well, so that our police department looks like our city. And we're very proud of that. So we have more minority officers, more female officers, and more officers that actually live in the jurisdiction where they police in Washington, D.C. In my current budget before the council, I doubled down on DC resident police officers in a program that we're very proud of that hires DC high school students, pays them as civilians in the police department, sends them to the University of the District of Columbia, and then they can enter the police academy as people who grew up here in DC. So we're very proud of that.
Now, there is a movement in many cities, and I think somewhat in DC, to reduce funding for the police departments. And some people want to defund it completely, but you have resisted that. So you're fairly confident that you can get your budget through for the city council?
Well, the city council is reviewing it. I know that they're hearing a lot of the calls that you hear, that I've heard, and in some jurisdictions may be valid calls for shifting resources. But we know that DC residents and taxpayers have been very generous to the government in allowing us to make investments across the board. So just in the 5 budgets that I've sent to the council, for example, since I've been mayor for the last 5.5 years, we have seen police investments go up by 12% over 5 years. We've seen on the other hand, education investments go up over 40%. In my current budget, despite the fact that we saw an $800 million dive in revenues, I actually increased public education spending by 3%. We can look at other categories too, like the human services, what we're doing to end homelessness. Those investments have gone up over 70% in the last 5 years. The things that we're doing for violence intervention, in partnership with the council, we created a whole new agency that is non-law enforcement police and public safety intervention or violence interruption. And we've gone from 0 to funding a complete new agency in those activities. So the bottom line, David, is our public safety funding is not just policing. It's opportunity opportunity programs and education and job training, and it's also intervention programs in violence interruption and behavioral health intervention. And I think the budget that the DC Council has exactly what we need in all three of those buckets.
Back on the public school system in the District of Columbia, when do you think you will make a decision about whether public schools will open in the fall?
We will make a decision shortly. We will have a summer bridge program that we expect to start on August the 10th. And that's going to be able to have our kids in the transition year. So we have some time where those kids are going to start early, I think in grades 3, 6, and 9. And then by August 31st, we will be ready for school. Our expectation is that we will have in-person learning with a modified schedules to accommodate social distancing. But I'm getting those final recommendations based on a survey that we've conducted of our public school families.
So when would you think that the district might be completely open? In other words, if all parts of the district can operate as they were before COVID-19, is that sometime next year, middle of next year maybe, or maybe later? Is there any guess on that?
I don't really have a guess on that. And I think a lot of it depends on the effectiveness and availability of a vaccine as to when we wouldn't have to have the type of social distancing guidelines that we expect to have through phase 4. Okay.
And what do you think the business community can do a better job of in helping you? The business community in Washington has, an interest in helping, I'm sure. Is there anything the business community can do that they're not doing that you would like the business community to do?
Well, I think that in various sectors of the business community can help us amplify this message, is that the response to COVID and the shutdowns related to COVID are bigger than any local government can handle. So really having relief packages that come through the Congress by sector are going to be hugely important. When I think about housing, I'm very concerned. We have been able to do less with our housing dollars than we expected because of the dip. When I think of the rent relief that people are going to need, both tenants and landlords, those are going to be huge numbers, and they are included in the HEROES Act, and that needs to get through Congress. When I think of the commercial tenants and commercial landlords, they're in a similar boat, and some of them are going to come back last, like our large venue tenants. So there needs to be relief there. Higher education, they are going to continue to be, I think, hit, and they're big employers in our city, so we need them to be addressed. I think there's been a lot of attention on hospitals and medical providers, so we want to continue to focus on that as well.
So finally, you are still running the city largely remotely. Are you in your apartment now or your house now? And are you going to keep doing that?
No, I'm in my home, but I'm largely in person. I'm running the city. We work out of a emergency operations center. Since the last time we spoke, I'm back at City Hall some. So I work between City Hall, our emergency operations center at the health department, and when I'm doing conversations like this from home.
Okay, so your daughter, Miranda, is happier when you're home, I assume, and when you got to go back to the office, she's not as happy?
She's very happy to have me at home, and it's fun to be able to take a break and play with her.
So, Mayor, I want to thank you for coming today, and thank you for giving us your insights, and we look forward to your decision tomorrow, and you're always welcome to come here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
Bye. So our final guest today is George Lambert, who's the president and CEO of the Greater Washington Urban League. George, thank you very much for coming today.
Good morning, David.
Good morning. So where are you coming to us from? Are you in your home or your office?
I am at home. Yep, I'm in home this morning. Still teleworking at this point and going to the office maybe once or twice a week.
Okay, so for those who may not know George, George is the head of the Greater Washington Area Urban League. He spent approximately 30 years of his career associated with the Urban League in various parts of the Urban League in Virginia, Ohio, Washington, and since 2014, he's been the head of the Greater Washington Urban League. He is a graduate of Virginia Union University and somebody who is very committed to the Urban League. But for those who may not know what the Urban League does, and I should say that my predecessor at the Economic Club of Washington was the national president of the Urban League, Vernon Jordan. Tell us what the Urban League does and specifically what the Greater Washington Urban League does.
Sure, David, delighted. So first of all, let me say that at our core, we are a civil rights organization. We provide services to many of the residents that we serve, particularly in the District of Columbia, Montgomery County, and also in Prince George's County as well. We help African Americans and underserved communities certainly to reach parity, certainly to reach power and civil rights. That is really the work that we do. We were founded in 1910, at least as a National Urban League in New York. We're still based in New York, at least the national office is. And let me also add a bit of context regarding the Urban League movement. We came about because in the early 90s and sort of the early 1900s, particularly around about 1910 or so, there was a great migration in this country from the South to the North, particularly for African Americans. They were really migrating to seek a better life in the North, really kind of trying to escape the vestige of the old, if you will, and certainly the Jim Crow attitudes of the South. But guess what? When they got to the North, they found that there was discrimination in the North, discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment, discrimination in many other areas as well. So the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, they took on a battle of really beginning to litigate many of those issues in the courts. There was another organization needed to really help many of the folks who had gone to the North to navigate their life in the North. And that brought about the founding of the Urban League movement. There are 90 Urban League affiliates around the country, I will share with you, and 300 states, so in the District of Columbia as well. So again, our footprint here is Washington, Prince George County.
So the head of the National Urban League, that is who? The current head.
Head of the National Urban League is current head is Marc Morial. Marc Morial, many of you should know, is the former mayor of New Orleans. But
Right.
Some of the other famous leaders of the presidents of the National Urban League have been Whitney Young, Vernon Jordan, who you certainly mentioned and alluded to a bit earlier, and then John Jacob as well. And by the way, Vernon Jordan was the person who really opened a door and for me to have a membership in the Economic Club.
Okay, so let me ask you, where do you get your money from? Is it from the private sector, from the government? Who are the sources of your capital?
It's a hodgepodge of all of those that you have mentioned at this point. Government, state government, federal government. Much of our money comes from foundation, it comes from individuals, it comes from corporations. Many of them are represented on our board of directors as well. So we are probably the operating budget about 5.5 million, but we manage and also administer another 20 million in terms of program funding as well.
So the racial composition of your leadership is not only African American, is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, we were founded as an interracial organization. So it's not only African American, my board of directors is a mixed board as well.
So if somebody said, I want to help deal with the challenges we now have on racial relations, and they wanted to help support the Greater Washington Urban League, what can they do? Can they volunteer? Can they give you money? What are you looking for?
We have, so all of those things as well. But you know what, David, we have been very intentional in terms of really kind of using this opportunity to invite, and we're hearing from many folks at this point, but to invite them to become engaged and certainly become involved with the Urban League. We have an advocacy committee where we're certainly very much involved with regard to what's happening now in the civil unrest space. Our board of directors, they provide wisdom, support to us. Many of them are donors to the organization. Companies, they come to us. We, in fact, work with a number of companies in what I refer to oftentimes as helping them to navigate through blind spots. For example, many companies now are reaching out, and we've even seen a lot of press, what's going on with some of them as they're really taking a hard look at their iconic brands with regard to, for example, and your mama, I guess a couple of days or so ago, they decided they wanted to kind of change that brand to be a bit more, I think, in lockstep with where we are as a country now, how we're moving as a country. So we're looking for lots of engagement. We have the Young Professionals, which is a Thursday network. They are very much involved with us in terms of helping us to move the needle, particularly on the social service front. So again, we welcome the involvement of those who have an interest in working with the Greater Washington Urban League.
So you've devoted your entire professional career to this area of endeavor. So why did you choose to do so? You could have gone into many different areas. Why was this the one that you chose?
So, for me, it is a moral compass. I would say it's a passion. And what I will also say to you is that, I also believe that every person, at least every Black person, I should say, in America, really each day is touched by racism. It's really very alive. It lives for us. I find that really when I look at it, we have been shut out oftentimes. We have certainly been denied access, other times. We have been killed while praying in church. And so, that's a lived experience that we deal with every day. My role and what inspires me and kind of my moral compass is that I get to inspire, find talented people to come to work for the Greater Washington Urban League, and then to get them to help us to deliver the goods or certainly deliver the services to those we work to empower.
So as you were growing up, did you experience the kind of police conduct that we've seen recently and unfortunate kind of behavior, or you were able to escape that?
Too many experiences to share, David, but what I will tell you this. So like the mayor, I am a native Washingtonian, so we are a rare breed. Did my early life, grew up in DC. But I had a mother that had lots of wisdom and decided both her sons were probably having challenges and difficulties in Washington, DC, and sent us to a place called York, Pennsylvania, which changed my life. Many times African-American mothers, particularly when they're raising sons, have to do that for their sons. So yes, I experienced it, and that experience really changed my life in terms of opening another door for me.
So as we go forward, do you think that the events we've seen in Atlanta and Minneapolis will spur greater change in race relations, or are you skeptical that that actually will happen?
I am very optimistic that we are in a different moment in this time at this point. The fact that, when I kind of look at the marches, the protests, I see that they are multiracial. And I think this is a time we certainly have to take advantage of that particular opportunity. David, you are a historian, you are someone who has lots of deeds in terms of your philanthropy as well. And so, I don't know if you can see behind me, but it is my home library. One of the books I pulled off the shelf today from my home library is your book. And your book is about writing about the history of America. And so, where we're at in a moment, this particular moment in time, I don't necessarily envision sitting around the fireplace talking to my grandkids about what's happening in this moment of time, how we miss changing and making the opportunity. I envision how we look at resetting, taking advantage of this moment in time and resetting. And those are the kind of history stories that I want to be able to share with my grandchildren. This is what we did in this particular moment of time. This is how we changed the trajectory, and this is how we move forward. And hopefully there'll be other stories that you'll write about as well.
George, if I'd known you were going to talk about my book, I would have had the entire show with you today. I would have had nobody else. But now you have 4 daughters, or you have 4 children? You have
my wife and I, we have 5 there. I can't call them children anymore. They very quickly remind me they're young adults. So let me say
and you have grandchildren yet?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, I hope they live to grow up in a world that's a little bit different than the world that you grew up in and I grew up in. But I want to thank you, George, for what you're doing for the Urban League. And that's an impressive library you have behind you. And I want to thank you for being a member of the Economic Club and also for coming on today and letting us know more about it. If people want to send you money, they can send it to your website, which is what?
www.gwl.org.
Okay. And your offices are where? Your main offices?
Our main office is at 14th and Harbor, 2901 14th Street Northwest. We also have a satellite office in Prince George's County, but we provide additional services in Montgomery County as well.
All right, George, thank you very much for coming on and letting us know more about the Greater Washington Urban League. Thank you.
David,
Appreciate
thanks
it.
so much. Appreciate it.
So I want to thank everybody for coming today and listening. And I want to remind everybody that our recording of this show will be on economicclub.org right after the end of this. And that we have an event coming up next week, June 23rd, with Michael Nydorf and some others that we'll announce shortly. Thank you very much, and thank you to our sponsors. Good day.